Today's episode is a book review written by Brother Lawrence about practicing the presence of God. There are multiple versions, and in this episode, Jason and I flipped the script. He's going to be asking me questions about the reading. Welcome to the 3D Disciples podcast, where we're working together to develop disciples who display God's love as we deploy into God's world. Join us on this journey by liking, subscribing, and following this channel. I'm your host, Hannah, and alongside us is the pastor of FBC Clarion, Jason Hunter. May Jesus help us climb to new heights.
With the exception of the Bible itself, it is estimated that the practice of the presence of God has been read by more Christians than any other book in the past 300 years. It is remarkable, then, that this little collection of conversations, letters, and maxims was written not by a trained writer or a theologian, but by a man who spent most of his time in the kitchen. Frankly, this celebrated book doesn't overwhelm with reason like the arguments of Aquinas or sing like Augustine's poetry. Instead, it owes its popularity to the humble, simple, and practical insight of the unassuming spiritual master it centers on, and that is Brother Lawrence.
Mm-hmm.
Tonight, we're doing our book kind of review, and we're looking at a book called The Practice of the Presence of God. It's about Brother Lawrence, who was a monk in the 1600s. So we're kind of flipping the script, and we talked about doing this. People probably need to know up front that Hannah and I actually read two different versions of this. Her book is Practicing His Presence. Who is the editor? Does it have the editor of yours?
It doesn't. I mean, in the inside, it just says who the copyright was.
Okay.
The seed sowers.
Oh, I think Frank.
Well, Frank Laubach is in the first half of the book. It's like just his letters from the 1930s.
Okay.
So he's not the editor either.
And then mine's called The Practice of the Presence of God, a Modern Translation. So I had read yours. I've read various versions. There's actually, I don't know how many versions of Brother Lawrence's, of this book, reiterations of it that are out there. There's numbers of them. But I knew you were reading that one. I'd read that one. So I got a different version, a modern translation, which is really nice because he was Lawrence,
French.
Yeah, he was French.
Yep.
And so all his correspondence was in French. So it's all being translated into English anyway. Yep. And some of the older versions have a little rougher translation, or at least a little rougher English. And they tried to be more word for word in their translation. Yeah. And the one I read is a little bit more focused on making it really readable in English. And so I really enjoyed that part of it too. So this is one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it to people. Actually, my chord, one of the things we're doing over the next month is we're reading it together as a chord, and we'll kind of be talking about it. So first question, just overall impression. What did you think of Brother Lawrence?
Yeah, he is like what you described. He's not this deep theologian. He's a simple man. And what I think of his thoughts is that you can just tell that he's spent a long time just trying to figure out how to have this relationship with God that exists every second of the day. And to me, that's, the best thing that you could possibly do. You can study all you want, but if you don't have that second-to-second relationship, it's just not going to, that kind of relationship is going to shine through more than all the study in the world. So, yeah,
Can you give a little, synopsis? What's his story?
From what, at least the story, the collection that I had was him writing letters to, you never read the letters of what people wrote to him.
Yep.
But you just read his responses. It seems like he was writing letters to people who were struggling with things in life, health issues, family members missing, or it was just like his general journaling of how this practice of just thinking on God all the time kind of just affected his life and how it changed it.
Okay. Yeah. So that's his whole thing is that it's called, he tried to discipline his mind to realize everything he did and every moment of his life, he was living in the presence of God, that God was continually present with him. And he tried to discipline his mind to never forget that. And so and in the same process, he tried to have what he would call constant conversations. And so that, like the whole time he's there, whatever he's doing, he's like, his job in the monastery, he was in the kitchen. And probably the pot washer. He was more in charge of cleaning than anything. And so while he's washing the pot, so Jesus, what do you think about this pot? Do you think I got it clean? It's that, but it's that, I'm sure it was much more elevated in his thinking than that. But that he's just trying to have he's like talking with God.
Yeah, and I was
he's there.
There was a quote that I wanted to read to the listeners as well, along that lines of that. He said, "Anyone is capable of a very close and intimate dialogue with the Lord. Whether you are one who finds this easy or difficult is not important. Just begin, be daring. None of us have a long time to live. Again, what years we have, let us live them with God." And that's what that practice, like he brought up a lot of other things that like he had tried in his life or seen other people try, to discipline themselves. And this discipline was the one that he just kept coming back to because it was almost the easiest, because it was something you could correct every minute of the day. Like, oh, I forgot to think about God for that minute. Well, doesn't matter. I have God's grace. Let me do it better this minute. And I've really resonated with that because we tried in my family to do kind of like the Sabbath, where every Sunday we slow down, we think about God, and we separate ourselves from things that, don't keep him in our mind. And over the last 2 years, we've probably only succeeded at having like a full Sabbath, maybe 7 or 8 times. So to me, it's very relieving of his idea of like, this is something that you can try over and over and over again, because you have an infinite amount of seconds in a day to do that.
Yeah, that's probably one of the things for me in my reading, in this reading of the book that I've picked up on. I think you're hitting on it here a little bit, is, and so his goal was to have this constant conversation and this constant thought about being in the presence of God. But he admits that, like, when he starts to work, his mind would wander, and when he first started trying to do this, that it would wander a lot. And he says as soon as he realizes it, he kind of confesses and repents, and then just picks up and goes on, and then he goes and never worries about it again. And so that's a statement that he makes over and over and over, that he accepts his failure, he admits to it, confesses it, asks for forgiveness, and then goes on and never thinks of it again, That's kind of his thing. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, he kind of refused to stress about his failure. He would repent it, move on, and did not stress about it. Why do you think that is so significant? Why? What does it, if we get caught up in really stressing about our failure, what does that maybe reveal about us, do you think?
That's funny, because like at first I was going to prepare the questions for you, and that was one of the
I get to flip them around today.
That was one of the biggest things I noticed in the book, was like, why isn't he like, how he was so calm about it, how he was like almost encouraged. He was just encouraged by the fact that he could always just turn back, and he didn't stress about it. And maybe that, and I almost put in my question, like, I pretend to be a bit of a perfectionist, and I was thinking of my husband too, like he doesn't like to fail at things, and maybe that does reveal that we're not putting God first, that we're putting our successes first, or our perfectionists. Okay, you're nodding your head like I got it, I figured it out. And I loved that, and I love that that he could do it with such, not with ease, but with such just acceptance. Yeah. And good word. I did love that a lot.
Well, and just to set a little context, so he was a Catholic priest, and so as a Catholic priest, rituals and you used the word discipline earlier. He actually makes fun of the disciplines quite a bit, because he's like, there's one place he'll just kind of talk about the disciplines are kind of useless because they don't produce in him what he's really this love and this zeal and the presence of God that he really enjoys. And so one of the thoughts I had, I think you hit on like this if we're really stressed about our failures, one, we're kind of got a pretty high expectation of ourselves, and that's kind of a reverse kind of pride almost. Like we had this real. The other one is I think it may show at least like a foundational belief in works righteousness. Like, if I don't measure up, have I been good enough? Do I know that I've been good enough? Good enough? And so I see in Lawrence really someone who's comprehending grace.
Yeah, that's what I got too.
That he's really understanding. Like he's like, I'm poor, I'm wretched, I am horrible. There's a couple of quotes where he describes how he sees himself, and it's always like, I am nobody, I am nothing. And he's okay with that. And yet the King of Kings loves me and feeds me from his own hand, and that kind of.
To me, it seemed like you really. I can't think of a better way to say this, and like other than he got God, like he got all the different things that, what a relationship with, what a relationship with God is supposed to be like on this earth, and that it's not perfect, and potentially, I mean, I don't know if we should use the word perfect when you get to heaven, but that it does require grace when we're living it out here on this earth. And that was a big thing that I caught from him too, was like, he seems to understand this grace concept way more than I do.
Yeah, and I think there's times he talks about like when he thinks about who God is, like he has to constrain himself from almost screaming in joy. He's so happy on the inside, and he knows he's wearing it on his face, and he like almost has to try to like calm down. But I think if you got grace like he did, you would be like, woohoo! You'd be like running around. Grace, I understand grace. I've got grace. I think that's something he tapped into.
That really oozed through the pages. It oozed through it. You could see. Yeah.
He actually, this is a quote that I had wrote down. He said that many do not advance in the Christian life because they're so stuck in penances and practical exercises. Like they get caught up in the religious activities. And they don't actually grow in their spiritual life. They're always, trying to do penance and try to make up for their failures. And he's like, you ain't getting there, and you're stuck. That was one of the quotes I had written down that I thought was really
and just to describe maybe a little bit the difference between your book and mine. You're bringing up a lot of things about him that mine didn't bring up at all. Like I didn't know his religious history, where he worked, what he did. It was just his letters. So I didn't quite get that quote from it at all, but it is interesting to hear that side of it too.
Sorry, I got to read my next question here.
You can put your glasses on. It's fine.
Oh, gosh, I forgot about that.
They're up there.
Okay, so one of the things he talks about, again, kind of the same idea, like that. So he makes this one statement that so as a monk in the monastery, one of the things you have to do in the monastery is they have assigned times of prayer. And so like all the monks would go to their room, they'd lock themselves in their room, and for an hour or 2 hours or whatever the assignment was, they would probably recite the rosary. They had a number of prayers that they would do. They would have to spend this time in silence and solitude, locked away in their chamber, praying. And one of his most famous statements is he would talk about his time in the kitchen when everybody was yelling for things, like at the service, like they needed things, and everybody's screaming in the bustle of the kitchen, that he could discern no difference between his times locked away in prayer and his moments in the kitchen, because he was so aware of God's presence all the time that it was the same. And that so locking himself away in this special kind of practice did nothing to heighten his relationship with God, because he was so aware of him being there all the time at every moment. And so the question I asked is, how are everyday things, cooking and cleaning and doing your everyday life, done in the love of God in the same way that religious things are? That's probably his, one of his maxims, that he would do everyday things. Whatever he did it with the exact same love as he would have done religious activities for God. So how do we do that? I
mean, it really would be like the practicing of his presence. And I guess what I gained, so I did attempt to to do this after reading the book, and what I gained from it, and how I was able to make this more of just like a religious activity, was I started having conversations with God, because like the one that I read, Frank, was open at the beginning, and he said that all thought is really a conversation with yourself. Instead of talking to yourself, form the habit of talking to Christ. So that's kind of like what I attempted to do. And when I did that and I had conversations with God, we ended up laughing together, which I've never done with him before.
Really?
Like I said something in my head to myself, and we like laughed at it. And you know, I have a tendency, like my dad described to me one time, he's like, okay, so he's like, when you get angry, he's like, you know, most people it like slowly builds. He's like, you go straight to here and then work your way back down. And so like this practice of just like having Christ there with me all the time prevented me from like doing those spikes. Like maybe I still did them, but not as extreme, because like he was there to like kind of taper me back. And so I guess in the everyday things, like you don't realize how much when you acknowledge that he's there, how much he can really change just like every little thing that you think about, how you approach something, how you admire something. Like when the snow was falling the other day, I was like, wow, these snowflakes like God made, and like, wow, God, good job. You know, like I was also like adoring him at the same time too. So yeah, that's how it kind of affected me in like the everyday things.
Yeah. So my thought on that is, so I've been kind of trying to, over the last few days, identify how what I'm doing is an act of love for God. Mm-hmm. So like in the everyday thing. So like, you know, how is, you know, picking up my child from school and giving him a ride home or whatever, how is that loving God in the moment? Well, mm-hmm. You've called me to be a father, and living up to my responsibilities as a father is me, you know, I'm grateful that, you know, the Bible says children are a gift of God. Mm-hmm. And so for me to care for the gift that you've given me, this is me saying thank you for my gift. Just trying to figure out how every moment, mm-hmm. These things, because that's what he talks about, you know, he had his duties and he would go and do things in life, mm-hmm. and he had to do those, and he would take God along with him, and he would like, you know, and if he got really bad, he said, God, I need your help. And then he would evaluate how he did it. And if he did good, he'd say, well, thank you, God, for helping me do good. And if he didn't do good, well, that's me. I should have thought about you more. Yeah. I should have asked for more help. So I've just kind of been trying to practicalize, like, how does taking out the garbage, you know, at my house, how does that an act of love before God? You know, how is this loving God by me doing these things? And just trying to come up with some way to make that connection, and these everyday things. Like, I'm not just doing this so that my house doesn't stink. I'm doing this as an act of God. Because there's one place he said, you know, he wouldn't even pick a straw up off the ground if he didn't think God wanted him to. Yeah. You know, that kind of just really permeated every of his life. Yeah. So, recommend or not recommend?
No, not now. I definitely do. And this practice is something that I will be attempting for the rest of my life as well. Because I saw how much, like, I actually want to read one of Frank's quotes. I believe it was at the very beginning. Frank had a really interesting experience too.
So tell that story so everybody understands. So Frank Lobach. Okay. Yeah. We'll call it Lobach. It's a strange name. So he read Lawrence. He read mm-hmm. Father Lawrence's original writings. Okay. And he lived in the 1930s, like you said. Mm-hmm. And so he decided to try the practice of the presence of God. He tried to emulate what Lawrence did, and he took a pretty detailed journey or detailed diary of his experience. Mm-hmm. And so the book you read has both those stories. It has Frank Lobach's journals of him practicing it, mm-hmm. and then in the backside it has the original writings, the correspondence, and all that we have from Father Lawrence is there was a priest friend of his who interviewed him on a number of occasions, and so there's some interviews, and then he and probably that same priest had some letters of correspondence. And like you say, we never get we never get what Lawrence read. All we have is what Lawrence wrote in response to people who are writing him letters. So there's a number of letters that we have, and then I think there's just some general maxims that he wrote out. So that's all we have because Lawrence didn't want to be published.
Yeah.
At one point he's writing a letter to the priest, and he goes, "You're not going to publish this, right? Because if you are, I'm not sure, I'll tell you, but I don't." Because he wasn't seeking fame. He wasn't seeking to be an author of anything. This was just, he shared it. Because
he just saw the reward in it
Yeah.
so heavily. I mean, based on the letters that he was writing other people, he's like, you can go through the best moments of joy and the most suffering because it came from God and he's there with you. Yeah. And it just made this huge impact. And that's all he wanted to share with everyone.
Right. He wanted them to have the same experience. So you're reading from Frank. So I just wanted everybody to understand your book was a little different than mine. Yeah. I really would recommend mine to people just because the English, like having reread it in this English, I'm like, man, this is, and that makes it so easy to read too.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you remind me of the question again? I can't remember why I was going to read Frank.
I don't know. Just read it and you'll remember. It's a good quote.
So Frank said, there's actually two here. They're a couple pages apart. It is exactly that moment by moment, every waking moment, surrender, responsiveness, obedience, sensitiveness, and pliability. I now have the mind bent to explore with all my might to respond to Jesus Christ as a violin responds to the bow of a master. And then he goes on to say later, I feel like one who has had his violin out of tune with the orchestra and at last is in harmony with the universe. The reason I brought this up was because I was going to say that this is a practice and why we recommend this. This is a practice that I will be doing for the rest of my life as well because of this harmony in the universe. Because God is the one who made the universe. And if you're recognizing him all the time, you're in harmony with that. And that just really stood out to me is like if you just kind of feel off balance, which I do a lot, just turning back to the man or to the God who made it all can make a huge difference. And that's why it's something I would highly recommend reading, and read it slow.
That was my next question. Any recommendations on how to read it? Yeah,
read it slow, more so like a devotional. I read it quickly so that we could prepare for this podcast. But also like maybe not reading it like a devotional, because that was one of the big things that Brother Lawrence kept bringing up a lot was like these penances, these like meditation and devotions didn't really pay out as well as just the practice of thinking God was there all the time. But yeah, just definitely taking your time, reading it slowly, and then and just see how much it like impacts your life, because it already has mine, and I'm curious to see where it will go.
Yeah, it's been a good reread. I opened with a quote. I want to close with a quote, and I just want you to hear how Lawrence pictured his relationship with God. And I think if I could have this, and if I could help other people have this, I think this is something to long for and seek. And so here's how
Can I ask you one question before you get into that?
Okay.
So one of the questions that I came through as I was attempting this practice was, do I need to clear my mind first before I try to like bring God in? Kind of like if you're bringing someone into your house that you like want to tidy up your house and make it look nice. Do you think that's something that we need to do first, just kind of like prepare it for him?
I think, again, I think it's the grace thing. I think just bring him in right where you're at. I think he already knows, you know, and he knows who you are better than you do. And so, like, bring him in and help him fight for that space and let him take over the space. And really, what we want to do is let God come in and clean it up, and not us clean it up for him.
Yeah, it's back to that whole thing of, are you putting yourself and your works above that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I really think one of his thoughts, one of the other things I remember him saying is like, when we sin, it's because we've gotten our mind off God. And so if we bring God in, then his presence will shine and overcast some of the other things that clutter our mind a little bit, I think. And then, you know, and we'll get distracted, but bring him back in and just let him make the other things fade in the distance.
Yeah, that was something else. Sorry, just to keep talking for one more second. That Frank brought up too is that, you know, there is some prices you must pay to do this practice, and one of them is that there's going to be a battle of wills. If you're willing to do this, you're going to have to lay your will down for God's will. And that was one of the things that was hard for me, and will continue to be hard for me, I'm sure, for my time here on earth. But
Lawrence practices this for over 40 years, and he talks about the first 10 years were a really big struggle for him. And then
he almost felt like he was not doing it right, didn't he? Like he was
he
felt like a failure.
People questioned him, and they were all these procedures he was supposed to go through, and these disciplines, and so he stopped doing those and started doing this, and he felt like, man, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So it took him 10 years to really to convince himself that what he was doing was actually happening. And then the next 30 years he practiced it pretty strong, and so it was a 40-year journey for him. And so here's what he says, and I think this is like, I guess my thought when I read this is like, if I could really understand Jesus like that, that would be worth a 40-year lifetime pursuit kind of idea. Okay. Here's what he says. He said, in short, I'm confident beyond all doubt that my soul has been with God these last 30 years. I haven't included every detail because I don't want to bore you, but I should tell you about how I think of myself before God, who I see as my king. I think of myself as the most wretched of all people, ugly, corrupt, and guilty of committing all sorts of crimes against my king. Touched with regret, I confess to him all my wickedness. I ask his forgiveness, and I abandon myself to his hands, letting him do with me what he pleases. But the king, full of mercy and goodness, doesn't scold me. He embraces me with love, makes me eat at his table, serves me with his own hands, and gives me the key to his treasures. He talks with me, and he enjoys himself with me to no end. In 1,000 more ways, he treats me in all respects as his favorite. Like this, I think of myself from time to time in his holy presence.
Wow.
For those of you interested in actually reading The Practice of the Presence by Brother Lawrence, or about Brother Lawrence, you can get a copy of that here at our Mainstream campus in our resource center. We have a place outside the office where we try to have the books that we review and some of the other books that we think are pretty crucial to discipleship available. They're free. They're for you to come and get. The one thing we ask is for you to read it and then pass it along to someone else. We don't expect it to be returned. For those at our online campus, if you will email me at Jason at fbcclarion.com. I will even mail you one so that you can have. I feel that strongly about this resource, and we want to get that in your hands so that you can begin the practice of the presence of God. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Our prayer is that you've heard something today that will help you be a better disciple of Jesus Christ. We also want to encourage you to make sure you take your next step in your discipleship journey by considering what it is you would do about what you heard today, and then go and do it. Finally, we want to invite you to join us at 10:30 on Sundays, either at our Main Street campus in downtown Clarion between Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's, or online at fbcclarion.com. God bless.